programs here at the Stimson Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here today for our morning conference, Nuclear Disruption, Navigating a Shifting Nuclear Landscape from Energy to Defense. Today's event is the first in which we hope will be a series of events exploring nuclear disruption as aggressive climate targets, energy security concerns, and nuclear arsenal expansion converge to present more questions than answers on the future of nuclear power, whether for civilian or military use. As the first in our series of events, this morning's conference will look to set the scene for us as experts across policymaking, journalism, academia, and the private sector provide an audit on the unprecedented transformation underway across both civilian and military domains. This series is ongoing, and we welcome your involvement and support as we examine the next generation of nuclear modernization, from deterrence to decarbonization. And it's fitting, I think, that Stimson is hosting this Nuclear Disruption series because the Stimson Center was founded in 1989 at another time of radical change, just months before the fall of the Berlin Wall and in the twilight years of the Cold War. Since 1989, Stimson has championed issues of nuclear security and nonproliferation. And now, as we mark our 35th anniversary, we're really poised to build upon that body of work through initiatives like our Converging Technology and Global Security Program, which has its finger on the pulse of technologies progressing at an unprecedented pace. Technologies like AI, blockchain, and yes, nuclear technology. Now on to some brief housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded. It will be available in full at stimson.org/events. We have a very fast-paced morning ahead of us, but we've earmarked a few segments that will include audience Q&A, including our fireside chat with Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, which begins at 10:15. We ask that you hold your questions until the appropriate moment. You will be notified when questions are permitted. For those in the room, we will be coming around with a microphone to take audience questions. Viewers tuning in online can submit their questions at stimson.org/questions. With that, we have a very packed agenda ahead of us, no time to waste. So let me go ahead and introduce our first segment, covering the nuclear comeback, as I welcome to our stage Ella Nelson, climate reporter for CNN. Ella, welcome. Ella, welcome, and thanks for joining us. By way of brief introduction, Ella is the senior climate reporter for CNN, where she covers climate-related policy from the White House, Congress, and relevant agencies. She joined CNN from Vox, where she covered the White House and the Biden administration's climate and infrastructure plan. She also covered Congress and the 2018 and 2020 elections. Prior to Vox, she reported on Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in the 2016 primary at the Concord Monitor. Now, just days from the presidential election, I'm guessing you don't miss the election beat, Ella. It's great to have you with us for this 20-minute quick-fire segment as you provide a look at the nuclear landscape from your unique vantage point as a journalist. So let's dive right in. As a reporter for CNN, a good percentage of your coverage has looked specifically at energy, specifically nuclear energy. What's driving that focus for you now, and really for CNN? And how are you looking to tell the nuclear energy story to interested but perhaps skeptical or uninformed audience?
Sure. Well, thank you all so much for having me. So, I mean, to start off, I would just say, CNN, we write for a tremendously broad audience, maybe one of the biggest audiences in the country. And I will say, people are really interested in stories about nuclear energy. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. I mean, I think that people are really hungry for big climate solutions. Whenever we write something about fusion or the latest breakthroughs in fusion, we have millions of page views on the stories that we do. I think that there is kind of this public fascination with nuclear because obviously it has a very, complex history. It's associated with 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, World War II, but also we are in this new moment now where, climate change and climate disasters, extreme weather is something that is constantly happening around us. And there really is this big turn to, new ways that we can generate electricity with zero carbon emissions. And obviously nuclear is a huge piece of that. But also, I mean, as you said, I feel like nuclear is so much a part of the story and how we get all of the power that we're going to need for everything that, you know, is already here, like AI, data centers, but also, you know, electric vehicles, everything else. So it's just really intertwined with all of this stuff that's coming down the pike really fast, I think.
I want to pick up on something you said about 3 Mile Island, because I think for many of us, we associate 3 Mile Island with a nuclear disaster in 1979 as the partial nuclear reactor meltdown. It was the worst commercial nuclear accident in U.S. history. But 3 Mile Island is back in the news. It's near Middletown, Pennsylvania. And the remaining reactor continued to operate safely, actually, until 2019, which many people may not realize. It was shut down after years, not because of the fear of nuclear, but because it was losing money. But just last month, Constellation Energy announced a 20-year power purchase agreement with Microsoft, which, if approved by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, will lead to 3 Mile Island reopening as the Crane Clean Energy Center in 2018. So I guess my question for you is, what role are big tech companies playing in driving nuclear energy forward? And has the nuclear energy as a sector shaken off the infamy of the nuclear meltdown for the American people? How are your readers sort of responding to CNN's coverage of this rise of nuclear energy again?
I think it's too maybe early to say, like, if it has shaken off the infamy, because we still have a ways to go. But I do think that, you know, I was just at New York Climate Week a few weeks ago, and I will say that AI and power demand for AI and nuclear were really kind of the talk of the town. It was very interesting to see it come up in basically like every panel that I was watching. You know, I just think that there wouldn't really necessarily be this nuclear revival if it weren't for the big tech companies. I mean, obviously, Bill Gates is inextricably linked with TerraPower, that project in Wyoming for small modular nuclear reactors. But, you know, as you said, obviously, this 3 Mile Island deal is really fascinating. It's really interesting to see nuclear, you know, obviously, there's a lot of talk in SMRs and advanced nuclear, but also people are just looking to continue propping up, you know, these older plants, whether it's reopening. Obviously, Palisades in Michigan is another one that is reopening. There's a ton of money that is going to making sure that reactors that might have been slated to get shut down don't get shut down in the bipartisan infrastructure law, IRA, all of that stuff. I do think, you know, at CNN, one of the things that we're just starting to do is kind of go to the public and say, like, what do you think about this? So we're still reporting that out, but I do think it is, you know, it's something, the ground is kind of shifting under our feet right now. So it's a really interesting time to be reporting on it.
It's a really interesting time in this town and in this country in particular. And I know you said you don't miss the election beat, but I think as we speak now, we're 2 weeks away from the election. We really can't get away from it. And energy and its role in supporting American jobs and local economies often comes up as a key policy platform. It also means that energy generation gets caught in the political crosshairs quite a bit. And I think about Harris's much ballyhooed stance on natural gas fracking, or Trump's attack on Biden's policies to expand renewable energy as a plan to make China rich, giving China's global leadership on green technologies. So my impression is that nuclear energy has largely sidestepped partisan typecasting and has, for the most part, thus far, it's not over yet, but avoided labeling that solar or wind and other non-carbon energy technologies have experienced. Is this sort of your sense as well? And if so, what is it about nuclear that has helped to buffer it against the winds of partisan politics?
I totally think you're right. I mean, I think it has been very bipartisan. I mean, obviously, we saw nuclear as one of the things that, you know, was passed most recently in a divided Congress, the Republican House, Democratic Senate, a few different bills that were recently passed. So I really do think that it is one of the few issues that Democrats and Republicans in Congress agree on. A couple of things. I mean, I think. I mean, historically, like, nuclear was one of those issues that Democrats maybe more were against because environmental concerns about, you know, proliferation, all of this stuff. But I think that the climate issue has really sort of, you know, started to turn more Democrats in favor of it. On the Republican side, I mean, I think Republicans like it because, you know, nuclear energy is reliable, it's easily dispatchable, unlike wind and solar. Obviously, batteries are coming into play to make wind and solar more easily turned on at any hour of the day, but they like it because it's reliable, it's dispatchable. It's these big plants that take lots of jobs to run. So it's something, a little bit something for everybody. I think that, what we are watching for in the election and what comes after is really kind of a matter of government funding and just, agencies being fully staffed and being able to continue the work that the Biden administration started, because under, Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm and a lot of other folks in the Biden administration, nuclear has become a really huge priority, and obviously a big priority of Congress given what was passed in the BIL and IRA. And so the question is, if, say, former President Trump is elected, what happens with agency staffing? What happens with that sort of work? Because I do think that people feel, especially with all of the government work that's being done in the national labs on fusion in particular, and many more things, is there a level funding? Is there enough people to continue to work on it?
I think the other big issue coming out of this election is sort of spheres of influence and geopolitical influence. And the demand for nuclear energy is not just growing in the United States. It's really a worldwide phenomenon. And in an effort, I think, to expand their spheres of geopolitical influence, we've seen the Russian and Chinese governments actively aiding their industries to win overseas deals. And this playbook has been really effective. Both Russia and China lead the U.S. in terms of the number of agreements with sales of nuclear energy hardware and services that are attached to it. Is the U.S. able to compete? Can it lead the way on more advanced reactors?
I think that's a huge open question, and it's a bit of an uphill battle. My colleague and I have written about this competition in a few different areas, but yeah, I mean, making sure that the U.S., signs agreements with other countries on advanced nuclear. This is important because these are really long-standing, diplomatic agreements to share this technology, and so far, China and Russia are racing ahead in this, and so it really matters from a diplomacy standpoint, whose tech is getting shared with the rest of the world. There's a big, geopolitical angle here too. The other thing that, that I've discovered as I've been reporting on this is there is a huge race, particularly with China, on fusion energy right now. My colleague and I just did a big story on this a couple months ago, but there is concern. Obviously, the U.S. has been out front in a lot of our fusion energy research, but China is just really racing ahead. They are outspending the U.S., particularly in the in the public sector, but also they are just moving really fast. And top officials at the Energy Department just told us that they are watching the Chinese build these new fusion technology parks at like incredible speed. And it really matters which country, gets fusion right. That brings a huge amount of influence around the world, a huge amount of technology that you can, leverage. And so both with, advanced nuclear SMRs, and fusion, the race with China is a big one. And then on the front with Russia, I mean, obviously one of the actions that Congress took this year was to, ban imports of Russian uranium. Obviously, that was needed. That was a huge response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But right now, companies including TerraPower in Wyoming and others are racing to find an alternate supply of enriched uranium. And the U.S. government is sort of trying to help out, but it's a big question of sort of, we once were this uranium enrichment superpower, but now we're kind of starting from scratch, and so there's a lot to compete with.
Up a little bit on the story that you wrote in September about Russia, and really how U.S. efforts to produce the enriched uranium that's required because of this Russian ban, the ban on Russian uranium after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. there's a couch cushion exercise, you call it, that's leading the U.S. government to scour for suitable nuclear fuel and the somewhat surprising source that the U.S. is dismantling to power the next generation of nuclear reactors. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't take credit
For the phrase couch cushion exercise. That was something that somebody at DOE said to me. But it speaks to, really the U.S. government is looking for high assay, low enriched uranium, or HALEU, which is the kind of fuel that is needed to power SMRs and advanced nuclear. Again, Russia has a lot of it. Russia was initially supposed to supply the first shipment of fuel for the TerraPower project in Wyoming, but since, again, with geopolitical context, that is no longer the case. And so ultimately, the big solution is enriching more of this uranium, and that is starting to happen, but at very low levels. In the meantime, the U.S. government is basically looking to its own nuclear stockpile, basically our Cold War era stockpile of weapons, and looking to see which ones it can kind of selectively take out of the stockpile, melt down in something that is literally called a crucible. It's literally a massive metal bowl that you melt down, old highly enriched uranium. You mix it with low enriched uranium. It turns into this molten soup, basically. And then once it has cooled, somebody can literally, hold it in a gloved hand with no concern of radiation. And this is the kind of fuel that the government just needs to make a lot more of. And they really are limited in, how much they can produce, or at least that's what they say. But again, companies like TerraPower that are really hungry for this, basically said they need to produce more of it because we need it now. So it's something that's really interesting to watch, but it really is, this kind of scramble to find it wherever they can.
I think just listening to your description, nuclear energy is perhaps unlike any other power source in its potential, both in terms of a next generation climate solution and as well as a weapon of mass destruction. Like, we can't sort of leave that out of the equation. So recognizing the two powerful faces that this energy wears, what role do you think the media has to play, if any, in demystifying or decoupling these impressions? And how do you consider nuclear's complicated past in communicating its possible clean energy future?
Yeah, this was really hit home to me in a reporting for a story that is not out yet, but I recently traveled to Indian Point, which is the decommissioned nuclear power plant on the Hudson River, with Bill Weir, who is our TV correspondent, and we are working on a story together about nuclear waste and how it is currently stored around the U.S. At various power plants and how there is no permanent home for it. And the thing that I really just sort of hit home to me, how the everyday person views nuclear power and nuclear waste is, I would tell my friends, oh, I'm going to this nuclear power plant to go look at some nuclear waste. And everyone was like, oh my God, like, what protective gear are you wearing? Like, are you going to be safe? Like, everyone was like really freaked out. We did wear our dosimeters, so we had, little measurements as we were going around the site. It was very, we had this they give you this big training before you get to go out and walk around. But, it really was, fascinating to see, like, this stuff is stored very safely. It can be moved safely. That's something, again, that the Department of Energy is working on. But I think that, as a top DOE official sort of told me, the biggest thing that people need to sort of get past, or that, they need to explain to people, is, I guess, like the Homer Simpson effect, which is that in our minds, nuclear waste is like green goo coming out of barrels. And in reality, it's metal rods that are stored in these concrete casks. And it can be done very safely. It's how it's stored around the United States. But I really think that, CNN's slogan is "Go there," and really, in whatever way we can, we want to go there and tell the story up front to our viewers and our readers, because it is something that has so much potential, I think, but really is, it's something that is kind of set in the American mindset, and there's a lot that we can do to talk about it honestly to our readers and maybe shift some of that perception a little bit.
Thanks, Ella. This has really been fascinating for me, and particularly explaining this to a both educated and lay audience about, how do we demystify all of these complex concepts. It has been really, really fascinating. We would love to keep going. I think I have a lot more questions for you, but I also know we have a very tight timeline today. So thank you so much for joining us to give a journalistic perspective on the transformation of nuclear, specifically nuclear's comeback story. I'm going to hand things off now to Phil Chafee, editor of Nuclear Intelligence Weekly, who's going to moderate our next segment. So Ella, thank you again for joining us. And Phil, over to you.
One, two, three.
4, 5, 6.
Can we hear me? Yes. Thank you so much. Again, I am Phil Chafee, the editor of this trade publication, Nuclear Intelligence Weekly. I'm here with Cindy Vestergaard. I'll give both Cindy and Christina McAllister have very long biographies. I will not give them all. Cindy, you're a senior fellow and director of the Converging Technologies and Global Security program here, but this is after a time doing at a blockchain company, and before that you were doing the nuclear safeguards program here at Stimson, and before that Cindy was in Copenhagen, right, at a Danish think tank. And Christina McAllister is the senior fellow and director of the Partnerships and Proliferation Prevention program at Stimson. McAllister came here from the U.S. Department of Defense as a senior advisor to the offices responsible for non-proliferation and countering weapons of mass destruction. And there's a very long biography before that, but I will just jump in because we don't have a lot of time. Ella spoke a bit about AI and data centers and this new demand that is turning back on 3 Mile Island and the Palisades plant in Michigan. Cindy, it is also, we saw last week, some big deals. We saw Amazon come in and say that they are not only going to try to turn on a new plant, well, they're not going to do that, but they are going to throw money at developing a new advanced reactor project in Washington State and into the actual developer. And that's after we saw Google do a comparable deal with a different reactor developer, Kairos Energy. The nuclear industry in the US has struggled trying to get new builds off the ground. Do we think we finally have the mix now to see actual new builds backstopped by big tech companies get off the ground with advanced reactors?
I think Ella's right that it is the big tech that will probably drive more of the advanced reactor and maybe SMR, but certainly the advanced reactor build and innovation in the United States. Possibly globally, but certainly here that's what we're seeing a lot more. I think it's also engendering a lot of different discussions, though. I mean, grids and taxes. That's what local populations look at, particularly with Susquehanna. There was a debate about, well, this is taxpayer money, tens of billions of dollars. What does this mean if now we're having another consumer come in, where I'm interested in making sure, from a local perspective, that my car is being electrified and also my small business and so on. So I think this part of the discussion is going to be probably something we're going to be seeing coming forward. But there is money now, of course, being pushed towards advanced reactors by big tech because of these very energy intensive a need for driving AI, but just in general in terms of the data-driven society that we're currently in.
And Christina, both of those deals were for advanced reactors. There's X Energy and Kairos Power, which have smaller than the large reactors we're used to, but also have some modularity, also have different coolants, different fuels than we have seen in most of the history of the civil nuclear industry. What are some of the pros and cons of these advanced reactors, which aren't being talked about just in the US, but globally?
Yeah, no, thanks, Phil. They are being talked about not just here, but globally. There's a lot of global South countries that are looking at advanced technology, well, nuclear generally, again, to meet climate goals, to meet growing energy goals, and also looking at the advanced technology and small modular reactors, precisely because they are a little more flexible, they're smaller, they can, in theory, they can be deployed to remote areas. There's inherent safety features and even inherent security features. So I think, there's and I think Ella already mentioned, the sustained output is a huge feature that everybody's looking for in nuclear. Just some things that everyone needs to be aware of on the security and non-proliferation side is just the unique fuels that they may be using, the HALEU, which is enriched up to a little higher, anywhere between 5% and 20%, creates more of a proliferation risk. And there are accordingly different regulatory frameworks for that. When combined with the small modular, the smaller design, even talking about transportable designs, floating designs, once the hair on your neck starts to prickle a little bit, and especially remote placement, what does that mean? It just raises questions like, what does that mean for staffing appropriately for security, the traditional guns, guards, and gates? Is this going to be in a conflict-prone area, and what does that mean for security again of this more enriched material? So just some of those considerations to bear in mind.
I was just going to do a two-finger on the AI part. I think one of the interesting things that we're seeing too is collaboration among nuclear regulators that we haven't really seen before. So there's the AI principles document that the UK Office of Nuclear Regulation, Canada's Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, get all the acronyms in, and then the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they came out with a document on AI principles. And I think it's interesting there to see, one, this multilateral approach, not in terms of regulating, harmonizing it, but looking at streamlining, I would say, and also sharing a lot of experience about what it means for regulating AI in a nuclear application. So is it in the control room? Now, we're not there yet, but there is creep, and there will be at some point the idea of a smart control room. What would that look like? But we have a ways to go. And also in talking with them, there is with advanced reactors, kind of talking about converging technology, let's just pack it all into these, and now more realizing, well, maybe we should just get one deployed first, test the technology before we start adding AI and all these other cool components.
I want to touch on HALEU and first go back 10 years ago. One of the primary goals of the US government's nuclear policies was HEU minimization around the world, converting HEU research reactors. Is there any sort of cognitive dissonance shifting from that, or sort of continuing that policy, while also now promoting potentially as embryonic HALEU industry, where we might have global reactors all around the world fueled with high-assay low-enriched uranium, which is uranium enriched up to 20%, nearly. I mean, go a bit more and you have HEU.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. As you say, it revolves around this, spectrum of enrichment of uranium. Low enriched uranium, I think, is generally defined up to 5% enrichment. Highly enriched uranium is above the 20% level, and above that, it can go quite quickly up to the weapons grade enrichment level, which is why it's of a much higher concern, and why the U.S. has spent a lot of time and money, as you say, working to minimize that around the world in research reactors and medical isotope facilities. HALEU is an interesting, that middle ground, but still below the HEU threshold, anywhere between 5% to 20%. I think it does have a different regulatory framework around it, and it is not defined as HEU. And so I think, while it revolves around that 20% threshold, I don't particularly see a cognitive dissonance there. I think the critical factor is just when it's combined with, more transportable, smaller SMRs and in a remote location with, again, as I said, it could be conflict prone. It just could, if it's remote, how do you get there after a natural disaster? Just these extra risk factors are things that indeed many regulators are considering, are there additional safety rails that need to be put in place? The IAEA is considering this also. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because on the security side, you've got category 1, 2, 3. And so HALEU falls into that category 2 side of things where it need extra security considerations to be put in place. On safeguards, the IAEA does have experience with HALEU in the research reactors, but not at a commercial scale. So, and then on the safeguard side, it says there's only 2 categories. There is LEU and HEU. That's it. And at the 20% level, a lot stricter requirements kick in. So this is why you start seeing a lot of like 19.75% for HALEU. But I think one of the things also that the agency is looking at is when things are in process. So if you are enriching to 19.75%, there might be, in the process, you might possibly go over 20%. How do you make sure the instrumentation is there to catch that? And then what happens if it's for a few seconds, if it's for a few days, I'm not sure. But the really important thing is that HEU from the IAEA's perspective is considered direct use material. In other words, it can directly manufacture a nuclear weapon. So that's why there's a lot more concern and focus on it. But it also comes back to what Christina said in terms of the packaging. So if we're talking about pebbles now. So if you have, China's HTGR has 240,000 pebbles. So how do you inspect that? Because right now, inspectors can go in, count the fuel rods, physically eyeball them and write it down. But for 240,000 pebbles, that's not actually doable. So this changes the instrumentation that's needed, the safeguards approaches. And of course, the agency is working with other countries on this. But it's all going to boil down to the first demonstrations and then as we are moving forward, which kind of designs are going to be the ones to catch.
Yeah. Another question probably for both of you. You mentioned the global south and this incredible interest of nuclear there. In recent years, we've seen the UAE launch a nuclear program, Belarus, Egypt, Bangladesh, and it seems like every day there's a new country with an energy minister talking about nuclear, Ghana, Kazakhstan, Serbia, Indonesia. What are the potential pitfalls of seeing nuclear technology go over? And also, what considerations should these countries have as they look about going from zero to a massive nuclear program?
Right. No, these are great questions, and I think they are really grappling with these. The IAEA has a whole milestones approach to bringing the countries along from step by step of what do you need in terms of the regulatory framework, and that's well established, and countries that are interested will be working through that milestone approach, and clearly putting in place the right regulatory framework for safety, for security, for safeguards needs to be front and center for all that. Another consideration is the huge workforce, very highly qualified technical workforce that is needed to both construct, maintain, and maintain over the long term. These are 100-year commitments that countries would be getting into, and it's not just about a one and done, but maintaining that as well. I mean, of course, there are Russia, for example, clearly has the build, own, and operate model of where we'll come in and, set it all up and maintain it and keep it for you. But you have to consider when you're looking at that kind of an approach. Again, speaking of disruption, of just how much the world has changed in the past couple of years. Russia is no longer, it's a reliable nuclear security partner, given the occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. and you just have to consider what it means to, make a 100-year commitment in those kind of cases. So.
And Cindy, you just came back from Australia, where there's a raging debate underway over whether Australia should launch a civil nuclear program. Do you have any other thoughts on?
Well, I think what was interesting there was the propulsion program has a lot of support. So defense side.
From AUKUS. Right?
From AUKUS, yeah, has a lot of support. I did 6 months back in 2017. What I thought was interesting back then was how many of the population under 50, certainly under 40, were talking a lot about the need for nuclear energy. There's a lot of issues with the grid, or grids, in Australia. So you see this coming back again and again, particularly a country that exports all its uranium. And many of the people I would talk to would say, well, why aren't we using that ourselves? It's our own resource. We should be using that. Looking at energy independence as well. And they're coming up to an election in the spring. So, but there has been a ban in place for decades, looking at that actually bars construction of civilian nuclear power plants. That said, I think from what I'm hearing, the discussion is certainly kind of wide-ranging, but there are very sober aspects to it that I think hopefully we'll be able to keep it going forward, because all of it is really about, what are the facts? What actually is the science? What are the safety concerns, security and safeguards? So we'll see if it makes any movement forward in the next election, but it's certainly a conversation that will be ongoing.
Yeah. Christina, you mentioned the Zaporizhzhia plant. One of the most concerning things there is the fighting very proximate, almost at the plant. Over the past 2 years. More recently, we've seen Ukrainian troops in Russia near the Kursk plant. And before this whole war in 2020, during the Azeri-Armenian war, there were threats by the Azeri government against the Metsamor plant in Armenia. As we're thinking about potential massive global deployment of new nuclear, how should this sort of new reality of military and conflict zones, what new considerations should the world have?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and sort of where to begin. I mean, this has really, the occupation of, first of all, the occupation of a civilian nuclear power plant is unprecedented, and raises just, you mentioned the fighting near the plant. That's certainly a concern. Although these plants are actually built to withstand certain kinds of shocks and attacks. But I think it's this the occupation that has really sort of led people to question. Look at the current international security framework and look at the gaps that we have. I mean, international humanitarian law does prohibit attacks on nuclear power plants. However, there are gaps for certain circumstances, and so it's not watertight by any means. And as you say, as these plants, as nuclear power goes around the world, more unstable regions, more conflict-prone regions, it is a concern. I mean, some countries, India and Pakistan, have signed bilateral non-attack agreements. That's one option. There's also been a lot of good writing in the civil society sector about, what the ways that IAEA can provide more guidance. They have been put out the 7 pillars around the Zaporizhzhia incident. It's not really an incident; it's a whole situation. And I think it's not just conflict as well. I mean, speaking of disruption, I mean, the climate change is not just driving the refocus on nuclear power, but creating more threats to nuclear power that may not be, direct security threats, but indirectly impact security of these facilities, and also needs to be considered, much more robustly and deliberately in coming up with regulatory frameworks for these facilities.
I think on that, I mean, we go back to 2014 because while yes, Zaporizhzhia is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, the Russians actually occupied a small reactor in Crimea. And what's interesting there well, first of all, I think we should highlight the unwavering dedication by the IAEA during this. I mean, it is an unprecedented moment, and they have stepped up and they have been there.
Full monitoring teams.
Full monitoring teams on site.
Yeah.
The IAEA flag is, I almost get goosebumps actually, in how dedicated they are to it. And it's, and I mean, even just the stat that I have here, I mean, even in the first, I mean, this is, of course, not Crimea, but in the first 8 months of the war in 2022, there were already 20 safeguards missions by the IAEA, and then there were an additional 8 to verify the absence of declared material. So again, I mean, just to highlight that. But what I think is also interesting is that, so in 2014, and within, I think it was 10 or so days, or certainly the first 2 weeks, the nuclear regulator in Ukraine told the agency that it no longer had control over nuclear material in Crimea. And that, of course, had an impact on its safeguards agreement with the IAEA. And no fault of its own, right? It wasn't in any way trying to stop inspectors from going in, but a planned inspection at that time to the reactor in 2014 was not able to go forward. And then in 2020, the IAEA actually removed the broader conclusion from Ukraine, which actually was only the second time that had happened before. And the broader conclusion is where the agency makes a conclusion that it safeguards in a country. It has verified both what has been declared and then the absence of any undeclared nuclear material. So of course the IAEA, not able to go to all aspects of the country's jurisdiction, then had to remove that conclusion, and of course has maintained that. But I think it's important to note that because of the safeguards missions at these permanent on-site as well for safety and security reasons as well, that the agency has been able to follow as much as it can in terms of proliferation risks and has not deemed yet that there is any specific proliferation risk. At the same time, of course, we have a nuclear weapon state that is occupying a non-nuclear weapon state and a civilian reactor.
We don't have too much more time left, but I feel like I'd have to ask about the election, given that it is 2 weeks away. Ella spoke a bit about there is already a not quite consensus, but a bipartisan agreement on civil nuclear and boosting it, but the Trump or Harris energy policies could go in very different directions. Trump has been very critical of the IRA and also the DOE's Loan Program Office, which is talking about or sort of supporting a lot of restarts and potential new nuclear projects. How important is this election to the direction of nuclear policies, I guess both at home and abroad? It's to both of you, so.
You want me to jump in? And it's true. I mean, when you look at the numbers, it's only an 18-point percentage gap between Democrats and Republicans on nuclear. It's actually the smallest gap on any energy. And that's certainly been a shift over the past 10 years or so. So I think that is something certainly that'll have an impact on the parties themselves, that people in general, and as Ella mentioned, are interested and also very supportive of different ways to decarbonize the grid. And so I don't think we're going to see, I mean, Trump has said that he is for advanced reactors and would get them, moving forward faster in terms of approvals. At the same time, I think what we're hearing from Democrats, and certainly the support that we see right now in terms of advanced reactors, the demonstration projects, and of course the $2.7 billion also for enrichment and developing a domestic capacity in the United States, I think that is something we're going to be seeing certainly going forward no matter what administration's there.
Yeah, Christina?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I broadly agree with Cindy. Trump has made some statements in the past about wanting to roll back some of the the really quite remarkable suite of legislation that has been rolled out in the past few years. And I think maybe, it's just a wild card, right? As everything with Trump, you're not really sure where it's going to go. But certainly, it could be difficult for him to do that, just given how much disbursements that are already being made under some of those acts, some of the legislation, and going to Republican districts. So I think, given the bipartisan support that we've seen so far, I think there's a good chance that it'll continue to move forward, especially given the climate demands and pressures.
Fantastic. Well, I know we could go on for hours, but I think we have coffee now, yeah?
We have coffee now.
So I will not keep you all from the coffee. Please join me in thanking Christine and Cindy.
Thank you.
me as newspapers have been bought by right-wing, like political, it's all right-wing.
Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Such a pleasure to see so many friendly faces, mostly friendly faces, here in the room, and I know we have many joining online as well. We're really delighted to be welcoming back to the Stimson stage someone who needs no introduction to this stage or to this group of people. She is, of course, Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. She serves as the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. And I am not going to, we've done this a few times, Ambassador, and I'm not going to belabor your bio because we could spend the next half hour going through a remarkable set of accomplishments that the ambassador brings. She is clearly and eminently well qualified to be contributing to this discussion that we are having today. Ambassador, you have very generously given your time on many occasions, as I mentioned. The very first time you and I sat on this stage, you remember, it was 12 years ago. You and I were just graduated from high school.
Right, that's right.
You were just out of high school.
Exactly.
Amazingly, you look exactly the same. Well, I have a face like a catcher's mitt now. You discussed at that time, it was, of course, Obama administration, and you were serving at that time as President Obama's ambassador for threat reduction. And you spoke very eloquently from the stage that day on the Obama administration's non-proliferation efforts, and particularly efforts designed to bridge the security development divide. How could we use non-proliferation assistance in a more sophisticated and expansive way? And so there is some poetry, I think, to bring you back here 12 years later, and multiple times, I know, in between, to talk about a different bridge. This time really examining kind of your much wider remit in the international security domain with climate, with energy, and so forth. So I would just want to jump right in. Mm-hmm. We've been talking for many years now about the so-called renaissance in nuclear energy. And I want to just give you a moment, maybe at the top, to a little bit set the table, just kind of riff for a minute. This is obviously a critical moment for the United States on this issue and the world, as we are sort of experiencing kind of this burgeoning renaissance in civilian nuclear power. And so I wonder if you would talk just at the very macro level, Ambassador, sort of how you view this renaissance impacting upon policy, and particularly U.S. national security policy.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks for Stimson Center inviting me back. I always enjoy coming here and having conversations on these important international security issues. So thank you. Thanks to Cindy, of course, for putting this together. Great topic right now because there is so much interest now on nuclear power and nuclear energy. And we can go into a lot more detail. But there's interest from around the world on nuclear power and nuclear energy and what it can do for so many things. I think people normally think of energy security, which makes a lot of sense because what it can do, which provides an opportunity for countries to think about how they could use nuclear power in their mix of efforts to meet climate change goals, and a recognition that really there's no one way to do it. You have to have a mixture of many different things. So there's a clear recognition of that, and so that creates a lot of interest from many countries around the world. But as you mentioned, and we could talk about this more as well, the connection with nuclear power and so many other things that can be done by having this technology. And there's things that the IAEA is doing in terms of promoting nuclear energy, things that the U.S. is doing with the United Kingdom on a sustained dialogue. But just in a nutshell, these are efforts to use nuclear power for many development issues and many issues that countries around the world, particularly in the global south, are very interested in. Whether you're talking about obviously climate change and energy security, but there's a lot it's doing in terms of cancer treatments and water sanitation and food security as well. We could talk more about that.
So you are the Undersecretary, let's not forget, for Arms Control and International Security. And so I wonder if you would, Ambassador, just talk a little bit about where you see, from your vantage point, where do you see nuclear energy headed? How is it impacting American competitiveness as you traverse the globe, climate, and obviously national security itself? And maybe a secondary question to that. As a national security professional in this debate over nuclear power expansion, are you the wet blanket in the Biden administration trying to slow everything down? How is the world of national security in our government interacting with this, obviously, a world that is dominated by not just climate and climate activists, but commercial power operators and technologists and so forth?
Yeah, there's a lot of connections. So traditionally, for many years, we have been promoting U.S. nuclear technology through our 123 agreements. And these are agreements with countries that we have to have before we can share and provide nuclear technology with them. And throughout all that process, the three things that have been predominant that my bureaus have been pushing is that nuclear technology has to be safe, secure, and proliferation resistant. So safety, security, and safeguards. Those are the things that we push a lot. And so we have been very interested in that because we know that other countries that have this kind of technology don't always promote those things. And so one of the reasons why we actually been promoting, and quite opposite from resisting, promoting countries to use our technology is because of that very important part of safety, security, and safeguards. So that's been traditional. Recently, because we have these what they call small modular reactors, which are smaller reactors, which a lot of countries are interested in as an alternative to the larger 123 type agreements, is because of that, the fact that they can have this technology. But we always promote safety, security, and safeguards. So that's obviously for the national security side. And fortunately, our counterparts at the DOE and NSA also promote that as well. So we're not quite there, so not so much being a wet blanket, but really pushing that because we also know that, when countries get this technology, they work with whoever provides it for 90 years or 100 years or so. So it's a long-term relationship that you have with these countries. And we've been very fortunate because we have lots of discussions and agreements out there. The State Department pretty much leads these discussions, and we have our partnerships with other interagency partners. Secretary Blinken just signed an agreement with the Philippines, and entry into force of that in Thailand, and we're working with Ghana and other countries. So we're doing a lot of this promotion of our technology. So that's the underlying national security perspective. But you also raised competitiveness, and so I talked about other countries like China and Russia, for example, who are also trying to promote their technology, and so I guess that would fall into the area of competitiveness. But one thing I also want to mention is the close relationship that we have with industry as well, and as we work on these agreements with countries and have these efforts and trainings with other countries, we're also working very closely with our industry here as well. And we're very happy with companies like Urenco and NuScale, which are out there, also working with us, and other companies and industry as well. So not quite the wet blanket. We're pushing it. We want countries to have U.S. technology. We want countries to promote safety, security, and safeguards. And that's a lot of the underlying rationale that we have.
So I want to push a little bit more on states' role in particular, Ambassador. And you mentioned 123 agreements. You know, I think for the uninitiated, when we think about the expansion of nuclear energy in the civilian space, we might think the Department of Energy. We may think. Can you define a little bit more the unique role that the State Department specifically plays in this? And you know, give us a little sense as to you've been in the role now for 4 years. How are we doing? Are we moving quickly enough? Are you satisfied with the progress that we're making? Are we falling behind?
Okay, so as far as the role of state, naturally the role of state is our diplomacy. So we are the lead agency department within the U.S. to actually have these discussions diplomatically with countries. We're the ones that lead on the signing of the agreements, like Secretary Blinken has signed some agreements, so we lead that aspect, which is traditional for State Department. And we have a bureau, our Internet Security and Non-Proliferation Bureau, which has a long history of doing these 123 agreements and now doing these small modular reactor as well. We work closely, of course, as I said, with Department of Energy and NSA as we do this work. They have obviously a lot of expertise in nuclear energy, so we rely on them a lot on that. We have people as well at state, but we work hand in hand with them. Also with the Nuclear Regulatory, the NRC Commission, because they are doing the regulations. So we work with a lot of countries. They also have to develop their own regulations. So we work very closely with them as well. And we also try to bring in other entities in these discussions. We bring in Commerce, obviously, because of the industry connection, Department of Defense to be part of these discussions. So it's a whole of government approach, but the State Department obviously leads a lot in terms of that. The State Department also has a number of trainings that we do with countries to help them if they're interested in this type of technology, even if they haven't made an agreement yet that they want to work with the U.S. in terms of long-term, in terms of agreements. We have a number of programs, one called the FIRST program, which is, see if I can remember, Foundational Infrastructure for the Responsible Use of Small Modular Reactor Technology. Yes, I got it all. And so that's a program that we have in over 50 countries and 5 continents around the world, where we are training them on all areas of nuclear technology. We work here again. We work with NNSA as well as the Department, the NRC. We have something as well called the NEXT program, which is helping countries to move from coal to small modular reactors, which is great. It has been very, very helpful. So we do a lot of these trainings. We also have other types of agreements, like we have the intergovernment agreements, which are legally binding and facilitate specific projects through government industry partnerships. We have MOUs, which are not legally binding, but these bring together government, industry, researchers in the U.S. and the other countries to help lay the groundwork for this type of activity. So in addition to the diplomatic side that we do, we also have these other agreements and other trainings that we do and work very closely with our interagency partners around the world to promote this. So this is an example. There's a lot of activity going on. And the question is, can we meet the demand? Because there's so much interest. There were, as I said, 50 countries just for the first program, training program. So we're seeing, as you use the word renaissance, really it's incredible. And last year at COP28, there was a lot of, so much interest in nuclear energy. I think for the first time at COP that there was that much interest. And I'll be at COP this year as well, and I'm sure we'll have just as much interest again.
Someone at the State Department tuning in is very happy that you got that acronym right. They're very pleased with their briefing. So Congress recently passed, as you know, Ambassador, the Prohibiting Russian Uranium Imports Act, and also approved $2.7 billion to advance U.S. uranium enrichment capabilities. I want you to maybe talk a little bit about the impact that you see of those two actions on U.S. competitiveness, on the global marketplace, as well as on the security portfolio that you, of course, are primarily responsible for?
Thank you for the question. As I said, we have been for years in this area working on our advancing U.S. nuclear technology. Of course, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a stronger interest in helping countries move away from Russian nuclear fuel and relying on Russian nuclear fuel. A lot of our European partners have already instituted doing that. The G7 has been instrumental in that. And we also have to move away from any kind of reliance on Russian nuclear fuel. And so what happened was this effort, bipartisan effort, is really a way to try to do that and to stop us from relying on that fuel, but also provide funding so we can basically find alternatives to do that. And so the idea is that we'll be off Russian fuel in 2028. And so it was great that it was bipartisan. There was a recognition in Congress as well as in the administration that we need to do this. And as we encourage other countries to do it, that we need to do it ourselves. And so that has increased our own efforts to find ways that we can find alternative means from relying on that nuclear fuel. So it's a really needed effort and puts us in line with what we're asking other countries to do it well, and some of the other things that we agreed to at COP28 last year.
You mentioned the word bipartisan. Can you talk a little bit about, is this one of those rare bipartisan issues? What sort of receptivity do you get from Republicans?
It is bipartisan, and I think everyone recognizes. I mean, when Russia invaded Ukraine, obviously that was a big issue, and the question was, okay, why are you relying on it, And so I think that the fact that there was a recognition that we were relying on that fuel, and of course that's money that Russia could be using toward its war in Ukraine. So I think that just created a recognition that we need to do something to actually make this happen for the United States.
And on the expansion of nuclear power more generally, do you get, again, is that another area of bipartisan cooperation with Democrats and Republicans?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, and I think the legislation reflects that. As long as we can recognize that, we recognize that it's ultimately it's going to help fuel the Russian economy that they're using for their war in Ukraine, and there's not there's the distaste right now for being reliant on Russia, overall for anything.
So you mentioned COP last year or COP28, and obviously looking forward as well. In addition to the announcements that were made at COP, there were some other G7-related announcements made on these issues in Japan. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about some of the higher priority kind of international commitments that you see. What are the most sort of one or two or three sort of that you would kind of most prominently put at the top of the list? And then talk a little bit about how the U.S. government is supporting. Are you satisfied with the progress that we're making? Is there more we should be doing?
Yes, very satisfied, because as I said, there's more interest out there than we're trying to keep up with the interest. When I have traveled, for example, to Southeast Asia, I'm just impressed by how many countries say we want 3 and 4 small modular reactors, even though they may not have yet all of the capabilities to actually do it. They recognize the importance of this in terms of their own energy needs, but when they hear about all the other things that nuclear technology can do for them, their development, that increases even more their interest in it. I think they recognize the value of U.S. technology versus other technologies. And so there really is a struggle. So I think it's a testament to our efforts, getting out there, having quote unquote ambassadors from so many different parts of the U.S. government, from our industry, getting out there and really promoting it. So I think we're doing everything we can to get it out there. Now the question is, can we keep up with the demand? But as I said, COP28 was really positive. I mean, that was my first COP that I had gone to, and I was impressed by just how much discussion was on nuclear energy. And there's something called the Sapporo 5, and I'm looking for, I just want to get the exact numbers correctly, since I don't want to misspeak about exact numbers. But these are 5 countries, I believe the US, Japan, the UK, France, and Canada, who have agreed to work together to help move away from Russian technology. So that was great. I got to announce that. And it's a commitment of that we've been able to put some of the money that we got from the bipartisan, we put toward that, the $2.72 billion, but it was agreement to invest $4.2 billion to create a reliable international nuclear fuel supply chain that's going to move away from Russian nuclear fuel. So we were able to put our $2.72 billion towards that, in addition to the $700 million that we're putting in other sources like HALEU. And then we also agreed for something called the Triple Nuclear Energy Effort, which has about 24 countries to try to triple nuclear energy by 2050. So that was another agreement that was made there. And then, so these are really, and it has like 24 countries. So it's a reflection, I think, of the interest in not just the U.S., but a number of countries for nuclear energy to move away from Russian reliance on nuclear fuel.
I mentioned at the top, Ambassador, I'm going to turn here in just a minute to all of you. So if you have a question in mind, please ready yourself, and one of my colleagues will bring a microphone to you. As I say, I mentioned at the top, Ambassador, an interesting theme in your career as you look back at your impressive resume. As I mentioned, you've sat on this stage talking about non-proliferation assistance and how that can help bridge the security development divide. You spent a lot of time in the last administration working on the global health security agenda, trying to find that bridge between biosafety, biosecurity, and public health issues. Now you've been working diligently over the course of the past 4 years, more on climate issues as it relates, of course, to both national security and to energy issues. So I wonder if you could just reflect. You've been a long-time advocate of the use of American foreign assistance, not just to advance American national interests, but also to help people abroad. And so I wonder if you would just talk to us for a moment and kind of grade the Obama administration's record, if you will, on kind of the panoply of engagement programs that fit that mold. How are we, how do you grade yourself and the administration in terms of its global conduct in using this sort of international assistance, specifically on civilian nuclear issues, but maybe even more broadly? What are some of your kind of your big favorites or areas that you wish you had been able to?
And you said Obama, I think you meant Biden.
Biden, excuse me, yes.
I know what you meant, but I just, some people are like, oh, why do you say Obama? There's a reason why I'm very interested in this area of work, the civil nuke, is because of what you're saying in terms of, how we need to use, our efforts in ways that help promote, obviously security issues that I care about, but other issues that other countries also care about, and these global challenges. And we have been putting, we fund a lot of the IAEA's work, in the traditional safety, security safeguards, which we've been doing for years. But this area of work, which has really blossomed at the IAEA, and still doesn't, I think, get enough attention, and that we've been doing with the UK through our sustainable dialogue, with the help of Canada and the ROK as well, and other countries. really is addressing a wider range of issues. I mean, as you know, I also promote the Sustainable Development Goals and trying to look at how quote unquote hard security work really in many ways helps to advance other types of security issues, quote unquote soft security issues like climate change, you mentioned health, water, I mean the SDGs. And I mentioned to you before when I had asked my 3 bureaus to look at how we are helping the Sustainable Development Goals, and they came back with the thick document of over 31 pages of all 17 goals. It was a great reflection of how much we're doing in the hard security space that really is helping in other areas, and not just in the nuclear space, but things we're doing in terms of like clearing landmines, for example, that we do around the world. And the State Department is the largest funder of getting rid of unexploded ordnances, for example, the stuff that we fund in peacekeeping, which we're also the largest funder in assisting that. So it was a way of looking across the board. And I wanted to give that attention because these are all programs that we're doing around the world, capacity building programs that we do around the world, all in the area of hard security, but has such a close connection to what we're doing in terms of the SDGs and helping countries who sit across the table from me and say, well, and every country has their own security dynamics and things that they care a lot about, and helping them help us. And so finding ways that we can work together, but they're going to be concerned about other things that may not be at the top of the areas that I walk into the room with. And so being able to say to them, yes, nuclear security is important, safety and safeguards are important, but let's talk about what else we're working on that can help you. All the stuff that we're doing with, funding Rays of Hope and the IAEA for cancer treatment in Africa, for example. The work we do working with Morocco and other countries on water security issues, things we're doing in Latin America on global health issues. And so these are things we're doing, don't get a lot of attention, of course, but things we're doing with the IAEA that we're doing independently. And for me, using our funding to address a panoply of global health issues. Of course, for me, focusing a lot on the security side, but how our security funding is actually helping some of these other things.
Is the international community under-resourcing the IAEA? What do you think?
Is what?
Is the international community, does the IAEA have sufficient resources? Is there more we can do?
I don't know if they ever have sufficient resources because of so much of what they're trying to do. I mean, whether you're talking about the traditional things they've been doing from the very beginning, or new challenges like Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, or trying to focus on some of these other areas that they're taking on. It's a lot. They do a lot for what they actually get. So.
All right, I'm going to turn to all of you. We have a microphone coming around. What I would ask is that you will take a couple of questions and to kind of merge these together if we can,
Sure.
Ambassador. The Ambassador assured me in advance that while she would love to get to know you all better, she does not need to know where you went to high school or the name of your first pet. If you could just give your name, maybe your affiliation, just out of courtesy so she knows who's asking the question. And as I say, we'll take a couple of questions. And my colleague Brandon is going to bring the microphone around. If you would just like to raise your hand, and we will up here, sir, and then this fine lady right behind, and then we'll cut across here.
Okay, name's Dave Onspot, no affiliation. I'm wondering if you've heard about the uranium deposit in Virginia that the property owners are not allowed to develop per the Virginia legislator or something like that. There's supposedly uranium deposits right here on the soil that allow us to become independent of Russia. I'm just wondering if you've heard of that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And we'll go right behind.
Thank you. Elena Sokova, Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. I want to pick up on something that you just ended the discussion on the resources for the IAEA work in this area and overall. Our center has done quite a bit in terms of looking into both nuclear power and non-power applications and intersection with SDGs. But one of the clear issues in this area, challenges, is resources, both for the IAEA to do more work in this area And in general, for countries to be able to employ some of these technologies, whether it's for cancer treatment, medicine, I'm not even speaking about SMRs. And the biggest challenge is how to get, for example, development aid agency or international monetary institutions to contribute to that. Because there is still a lot of stigma when it comes to nuclear. It's everything from bombs to Chernobyl that comes to mind, and they have been shying away. I don't know how much the U.S. have been working interagency. Is there a process, or how do you engage, or see, is there a possibility to get U.S. aid, for example, to be one of the contributors and working with maybe other financial institutions?
Thanks, Elena. We'll take one more, Ambassador. I'm going to help keep track here for this woman here on the. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Allie. I'm a Scoville Fellow at FAS. I appreciate your attention to global health, Ambassador Jenkins. And as the U.S. ramps up in uranium enrichment and nuclear energy, how are you ensuring the health and safety of uranium miners abroad and workers dealing with radioactive waste that may be exposed to radiation?
All right, Ambassador, we've got a smattering of questions here. One on the health and safety issue, a question on alternative financing for the IAEA, and a question on domestic uranium deposits, which maybe I'll just expand a little bit, and if I can, and have you maybe try to shed a little bit of light on, again, as particularly in light of the war in Ukraine and some of the discussions we've been having, sort of this push for, the search for domestic or other sources of uranium.
Okay, so I'm not familiar with the issue you mentioned on the uranium and VA, but there's probably others in the government who probably know more about that. But I could look into that. But I'm sure there's probably others who work more on that than I work on that. On the funding, yes, I know. For example, DG Grossi has one of the times he did visits to different international banks to try to raise their attention on these issues. And you're right. I mean. Earlier I had said, I referenced the fact that there's a lot of work that's going on at the IAEA and our people aren't aware of because of what you're referencing. People hear the word nuclear, and they kind of a lot of people run for the hills because they automatically think nuclear. That's changing, obviously, and I think the reflection of the interest in countries to incorporate nuclear. But I think you're right. The banks were still having a challenge getting them involved and engaged on these issues. I know the U.S. Exim Bank has put some money towards it. They were at COP28, and so they're more involved. USTR is involved as well in these issues. So it's something that we have to keep doing. And the IAEA, for example, has really wonderful glossies and really wonderful things. I always pick them up and I'm there. And they're there with countries and trying to make sure that people know about this work and how good it is. But it is a bit of an uphill battle. And we still need to get much more recognition of this work and get more funding. And I think that's one of the main goals, one of the main things that DG Rose is trying to do. And we're always very supportive of that. Because we need to make sure, because funding needs to happen because of this. They can't do it without money to actually incorporate. On the health issues, one of the things that we recognize overall is that you have more countries interested in nuclear power issues, that we also have to ensure that we have expertise to hit the marks that we need for safety, security, safeguards, but also other things like health, and incorporating, that's one of the reasons, for example, having other parts of the government like the NRC with health regulations. And when I mentioned the MOUs that we have, we try to engage different parts of governments whether it's industry or the government or think tanks or others, in these discussions and with our with U.S. counterparts to kind of look at the whole spectrum of what it means to have nuclear energy and nuclear power. What are all the things that you have to look at in terms of increasing, personnel or people who have to look at these issues. So that's a natural part of it. It's not just we have to worry about safety, security, and safeguards writ large. We have to make sure we also focus on what countries need to do to build up their cadre, to build up their legislation, to build up their regulations to do this. And that's why we have these trainings, but also these other MOUs to bring others into these discussions so that something does not get left off in terms of what needs to be done. Could you ask your question again about the domestic side?
Well, just in terms of I was just a little bit riffing off of our colleague here. As we are, as we look for alternative sources, right? Are we, where are we exploring? Are we doing enough? Are we leaning into that space? Are we able to compete on the global market? Given and it actually draws maybe a better question is this, Ambassador, from in fact one of our online viewers pointed out that the United States really came to occupy in the 50s and 60s kind of a leading role, obviously, in civilian nuclear power generation, precisely because the Atomic Energy Commission then really assumed 100% of the risk, right? They built the first reactors, and we have since migrated to this public-private partnership model, whereas the Chinese, the Russians have learned from our history in the 50s and 60s, and have adopted our model, right, in terms of the state assuming the risk. Do we have the right model here with respect to kind of this public-private partnership model, or are you concerned that the Russians, the Chinese, others are going to eat our lunch?
Well, being the, I think you made a good point about how their government structured and how they work with, the civilian side and industry. So they have certain advantages. But what I will say is we are working and developing closer relationships with our industry, working closely with them to map out and think about where we should be working together, what we're hearing, what they're hearing. We're very happy with working with companies like NuScale, Urenco, things that they're doing, and others in this space. So we recognize that we have to work hand in hand with our industries to make this happen. We feel very confident that we can match the demand out there with what we need to do, but that also calls into question how much we need to work together with industry to meet the demands and to be as competitive as other countries like Russia and China are in this space. So these are the conversations that are happening on a regular basis. We're very happy that we have a whole of government approach that's working with our industry on this. So yeah, I think we feel pretty confident. I think you'll hear from some of your industry today as well, and I'm sure that they'll give their perspective on that in terms of the challenges that we have versus the way in which Russia and China are structured to deal with this issue.
Let me ask you an exit question, Ambassador. Sure. This will be the last time, I suspect, that we sit on this stage with you sitting in this particular role, and as we look to a new administration in January. You've occupied the role now as Undersecretary for the past 4 years. Thank you for your service. What do you wish you had known then that you know now? What do you wish someone had told you as you walked into leadership at the T branch?
I would say I always have a problem with these kind of questions because we are. I think in general. But I don't know if anyone could have told me this because I think none of us were prepared. But each administration have issues that they didn't anticipate, right? So it's hard to say what somebody could have told me because no one really knew. So I guess I'll turn it around to say that, I think at the beginning of the administration, we certainly did not anticipate all the things that have happened of such a global scale. We knew about emerging technologies were out there, so we knew that that was going to be a challenge in terms of how that is incorporated or how that inserts themselves, the different technologies, into issues that we deal with from a national security perspective, but other parts of the government and other issues as well. So we knew that. But, when you have, in addition to that, Russia invading Ukraine, dealing with that, and then, what happened on October 7th last year. And then you bring in, and I talk about this several times, and you bring in other domains now. So now we've got to worry about outer space and what's happening in the Arctic. And, it's no one, it's not like people knew all these things would happen, but having everything happen at the same time has created a very challenging environment. And so I just think you just always have to be ready for the unknown. And I think everybody knows that. I think that's common sense, but then not knowing what the unknown is going to be. And the challenges that it's going to create for everything that almost everything that we do is touched by one of those things, if not more than those things. And it creates a change in terms of how much we can focus on the things we would have liked to focus on when we came in. The amount of time it takes from the energy, the amount of money it siphons off from other things that we would have liked to do. Is part of the process of being in the administration, of any administration, and not knowing what happens. But it's also, I think, the amount of uncertainty that we have is very uncomfortable for not just government, but all of us who work in this space, whether you're doing it from a NGO, think tank, industry space. We're all dealing with uncertainty from all of these issues, and trying to develop policies based on uncertainty is not comforting. And I say that because but I also realize you have to be comfortable with uncertainty. You have to find a way to be comfortable with that, because that's just where we are. And so you just got to deal with what the cards are dealt with. And so it's challenging, and these are things that go beyond this 4 years, because they're things that we don't know where things are going to be. We don't know what the European security structure is going to look like. We don't know how we're going to figure out emerging technologies. We may not know that for many years as these things develop. We're not going to solve, Russian interest in nuclear weapons in outer space maybe in the next couple months, or we're not going to figure out. We may not know what's going on with the Middle East. So these are things that go beyond this administration to figure out. But we're at the time where a lot of these things happened. And it may take many generations for some of these things. So it's an uncertain time, but we have to learn, and I've learned to get over the, wow, this is a surprising thing, and just move on to the what do we do? How do we deal with it? And still know it's uncertain, and still know we won't have the answers. So I think that's where a lot of us are, because we're all dealing with that. And we're all trying to find answers in issues that we all care very much about.
So you're tormenting me, Ambassador, because you're introducing so many issues that I would love to ask you. I would love to talk for the next hour with you about Russia, Ukraine, about Middle East, about China, about so many of the issues that of course, we did not have an opportunity to do. Thank you for making the time to do this. I really am very grateful. We really wish you well as you run through the tape here at the nearing the end of the Biden administration. What I would like, before I ask you to join me in thanking the ambassador for joining us today, I just want to first ask you all to keep your seats. What we are going to do next is have a very quick flip. We're going to ask my colleague, Cindy Vestergaard, who directs our Converging Technologies and Global Security Program, to come to the stage. And in fact, she is going to have a quick fire conversation with one of the companies that you referenced, Urenco, which will be a great conversation. So please keep your seats. But first, please join me in thanking Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins.
questions.
Kirk. So this is a chance to grill industry on obviously the topic of nuclear disruption. Kirk, you and I think it's been about maybe 15 years that we've known each other.
I think that's accurate.
And the world has kind of, on the nuclear side, kind of stayed constant for a while. You're now an advisor to Urenco. You've held some other positions before, such as president of Urenco USA. And so, you know, the R word was tossed around before. From an industry perspective, are we in a renaissance?
Yeah, there's a lot of R words I think we can talk about with nuclear. I think renaissance is clearly one of them. You know, we've got, as we've heard from the previous speakers, we've got all of the elements that are necessary for a renaissance. We've got really supportive government policies, including money. We've got broad public acceptance of nuclear power. And we also now, thanks to big tech and government legislation, we've got capital. And nuclear power is a prodigious consumption for capital expenses, and that's a big enabler for a renaissance in nuclear power. I think in some respects, though, we're in a recovery mode as well. I think as you and I have talked, nuclear generation globally actually peaked in 2006, and it's remained somewhat steady over that entire time because the West really did back away from the use of nuclear power, mainly for economic reasons over the last 20 years. But we really are getting back to a more broad use of nuclear power to address the issues of both energy security and climate security. And I think as previous speakers have said, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has really put a focus on energy security, not just with nuclear, but it's caused a focus on countries and organizations saying, where are our dependencies, and should we have those dependencies, and how much can we afford to spend to eliminate those dependencies that are not in our strategic interests. And I think nuclear power and the development of Western nuclear power technologies and Western nuclear fuel cycle is clearly a strategic advantage, as reflected by the Sapporo 5 and other COP initiatives.
And Urenco actually has some new clients, some new customers
We do.
that have come.
We do. You know, it's interesting. The nuclear fuel cycle is largely dependent on private investments for growth, and those private investments are driven by long-term supply contracts from our customer base. There haven't been a lot of them from the small modular reactor and advanced reactor community, simply because it is a bit of a chicken and an egg situation. They are looking to demonstrate the technological and safety aspects of, you know, what are, you know, to date PowerPoint reactors. And yet they need fuel in order to demonstrate that. We, on the other hand, aren't willing to make the hundreds of millions and billions of dollars of investment in new fuel cycle infrastructure in order to just deliver a single reactor core or a single reload. But the catalyst that the nuclear fuel cycle experienced is, again, related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All of a sudden, there is a significant increase in demand for non-Russian nuclear fuel. And that's a fairly substantial boost to the West, because Russia has been supplying, you know, consistently 25 to 30% of the globe's enrichment demand or enrichment needs. So we are already gearing up to replace that, both here in the United States as a result of the legislation that will ban Russian uranium as in 2028, but also in Europe, where there is no similar legislation, but there is a strong push to diversify away from Russian fuel supplies for strategic reasons, even absent any legislative necessity to do so.
Well, let's talk about the expansion, because Urenco is a British, Dutch, German stakeholders consortium. You have a facility in the United States, so there's 4 facilities in 4 countries.
Right.
And so take us through a little bit about the expansion and update modernization efforts that are ongoing, and also a little bit more kind of tease out this 2028 number with the ban. How did that number come around? Obviously, industry was approached. The U.S. must feel confident that it is able to have enough domestic capacity to replace that loss from Russia.
Yeah, I think that's right, and you're right. There was quite a robust discussion. It was a bipartisan effort to put that legislation in place, and they consulted. Congress consulted a vast array of stakeholders in the United States: consumers, producers, policymakers, et cetera. I think in 2028, the level of expected Russian imports was always going to drop to 15% of U.S. demand as a result of the Russian suspension agreement, which has been in place in various forms since the early 1990s. So there was already going to be a reduction in the use of Russian nuclear fuel, which Western industry was being prepared for. And we were being prepared for it by our customers, who realized they could no longer continue this dependence, the same level of dependence on Russian fuel. So they were already making long-term contracts for increased supplies of non-Russian fuel. And I think 15% is an additional 15% of capacity, at least in enrichment space, is well within the regulatory limits that are already established for the 5 different enrichment facilities in the West, the 4 that Urenco operate, as well as Orano's facility in France. So the expansions that are already announced and underway include 1.9 million SWU in expansion at our U.S., Dutch, and German enrichment plants, as well as 2.5 million SWU that Orano intends to add at their French enrichment plant, which is a very robust addition, incremental addition to existing supplies. Even before we talk about adding capacity, though, even with the existing operations, we can change the amount of enriched uranium that's being produced. And we can do this through re-optimizing our operations at centrifuge enrichment plants. Enriched uranium has 2 ingredients, natural uranium and enrichment work. And we can change the proportion of those 2 ingredients to change the output of our plants in terms of enriched uranium. And in the last 10 years, we've been using quite a lot of our capacity to actually produce natural uranium. So we weren't using all of our capability to produce enriched uranium, and that has changed quickly as the demand for non-Russian fuel has increased. So we're re-optimizing the plants. We're also refurbishing plants. When prices were low and there was no projection of them increasing, it didn't make sense to replace failed centrifuges. Centrifuges are extremely robust pieces of equipment. They can last for decades, but they're not permanent installations. They do fail. So given today's economic climate and the market that exists, there is an economic case to refurbish and recover capacity that has historically operated in the past. The final thing we can do is restructure contracts with customers. So there are customers that may not have enjoyed the nuclear operations that they expected to have. So their need for nuclear fuel has gone down. And some customers are willing to contract for less to reflect that, and that frees up more nuclear fuel to serve new demand for non-Russian fuel.
But also the supply chain aspect leading up, another 2 years and a bit. 3 years and a bit.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about what it means in the supply chain and making sure all of that is set up as well.
Yeah, so in terms of actually increasing capacity, I mean, what we need is centrifuges and the associated specialized equipment. And both Orano and Urenco rely on a joint venture company that each of us hold equal shares in Enrichment Technology Company. An Enrichment Technology Company produces all of the centrifuge-related components and pipework to facilitate expansion of operating facilities. And we realized, several years ago that ETC would need to be revitalized because there has been no demand for new centrifuges, since expansion stopped finally in 2018 in the United States. So part of what needed to be done pretty quickly was to essentially recapitalize and restart centrifuge and associated equipment production at ETC. They've been quite successful at rehiring and new hires of very specialized folks that manufacture the centrifuges and restarting supply chains. In fact, we just celebrated 2 weeks ago the installation of the first new centrifuge in the United States since 2018 when we stopped expanding there. So
There you go.
we're on our way to turn on new cascades and increase enriched uranium production next year at UUSA.
Well, congratulations. That's a milestone. And also Louisiana Energy Services, the operator of the Urenco facility in the U.S., also recently received an award with three others for HALEU production.
Yeah.
We've been talking about HALEU. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that and in terms of what now it means to be engaging in this new enrichment category.
Yeah. Well, as we've heard today, the nuclear technology is moving on from light water reactor technology. It's not moving on entirely for it because there are lots of really good viable designs, light water reactor technology that are being deployed and studied around the world, including BWRX-300, AP1000s, EPRs. So that technology is not going away and it's not dead. But there are additional technologies, advanced reactors, which utilize a higher concentration of U-235. So at UUSA, we have a two-prong approach. And the first prong is to adapt as much of our existing capacity as we can to produce up to 10 weight percent enriched material, so 10% concentration of U-235. This is useful for many of the advanced reactor companies. In fact, we have contracts to supply two of them, Ultrasafe Nuclear and Jimmy Energy in France, with initial cores of LEU+, so that they can demonstrate their microreactor technologies. And those deliveries will be happening in the next couple of years. We have been engaged with the NRC in relicensing our facility in New Mexico for the last couple of years and are nearing the end of that process. So expect to have an amended license to produce up to 10% U-235 from the existing site with very few physical modifications changed by the end of this year.
And you also have a facility in the UK as well, no? HALEU.
Right. So the next step beyond producing 10% U-235 is to produce up to 20% U-235 for another category of advanced reactors. So we announced, or the UK government announced over the summer, a cost share program with Urenco, where they will be contributing 196 million pounds, and Urenco will contribute the other half of that expense to create a facility at our Capenhurst facility that will take enriched uranium and boost it further to high assay LEU, 20% U-235. We'll be producing this facility will be capable of producing 10 metric tons of high assay LEU by 2031. We've also we're one of the awardees by DOE in their HALEU procurement effort. So we look forward to delivering on the first task orders under that award, as do, I'm sure, the other companies that have been given awards.
One last question before we turn the tables, actually, or turn the discussion onto weapons. But first, in terms of the regulatory challenges, I mean, moving, obviously expanding capacity, but also HALEU. Can you take us through a little bit some of the regulatory challenges that you might have come across?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, we've got really supportive government policies. So from a political level, we've got a lot of support for expedited regulation. We got the ADVANCE Act in the U.S. that has supposedly streamlined the licensing of new reactors, for instance, and whatnot. So I think we're in a pretty good position with the Sapporo 5 and many Western governments trying to facilitate the licensing of new technologies and expansion. I think where we, it's sort of the second level that we really need to be wary of. For instance, one of the challenges that we have is in getting new employees security clearances. So we deal with highly sensitive technology. We need certain security clearances. That's a very time-consuming task. So even if you have the people in place, you might not have their security clearance in place. That's true for ETC as well. Export permits are another sort of area that you have to keep constantly ahead of, because there are all kinds of really good laws and regulations governing the export of sensitive nuclear technology and the import, but the process for actually getting those permits issued is somewhat arcane, I would say. It hasn't really kept up with information technology capabilities. So it's little things like that. Transportation of different forms of high-assay LEU is something that has never been needed before. So packaging, transportation packages for different forms of high-assay LEU in the forms of metal or TRISO fuel or whatnot, I think those things need to be focused on and ensure that they're not a choke point in the development of new nuclear power.
Great. Well, thank you. Kirk Knoebelen, advisor to Urenco. And if everyone can just stay in their seats, we're going to do a little bit. We're going to add an extra chair. And then my colleagues, Dan, Chris, and we're going to bring Phil back to the table. So welcome. Thank you to Kirk.
Hello again. So we are, as Cindy said, shifting course a bit, moving on from civil nuclear to nuclear weapons. Not usually my focus, but hopefully I will ask intelligible questions. First, I will introduce Dan Grazier, is a senior fellow for the National Security Reform Program here at Stimson. Before Stimson, Dan was at the Project on Government Oversight for over a decade. And in both places covering the root causes of runaway U.S. defense spending and military ineffectiveness. As always, there are long biographies here. I'm just doing some highlights. Chris Pebble is a senior fellow and director of the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program here at Stimson. And Chris came here from being the co-director of the Atlantic Council's New American Engagement Initiative. Chris is interested in a lot of things, but I will highlight some of your books, actually, which sound great. Peace, War, and Liberty, Understanding U.S. Foreign Policy, and The Power Problem, How American Military Dominance Makes Us Less Safe, Less Prosperous, and Less Free. I am going to start with the absolutely worst question, which is the election coming up.
Wait, we have one of those?
As Christina said earlier, Trump is sort of a bit of a wild card, so it's very hard to talk about what directions a Harris or a Trump administration might go. But I'm going to ask you anyways, particularly as we think about the massive nuclear modernization program underway here, but also how the government is thinking about strategic nuclear thinking. How might the Harris and or Trump administrations change the picture?
Well, I'll start. I mean, the fact that President Biden continued the plans to modernize the nuclear triad, the land-based ICBMs, the bombers, and the submarines, the same decision that the Trump administration affirmed the Obama administration's decision to modernize the triad, it is highly unlikely, it seems to me, that the Harris administration will reverse themselves. I think they should, but I don't think they will. So that's where we start, right, is that the triad is being modernized at considerable cost, and Dan's written a lot about this and has a lot more to say about the details. And I think that we've missed multiple opportunities to revisit the rationale for the triad, which I think is at least should be subjected to greater scrutiny. So I think it's unlikely that we'll see a departure from either the Harris or Trump administration on the decision to modernize. Now, the one question I think is an open question is about spending, about the level of spending that we're likely to see in general on the military and then for the nuclear enterprise. Some within Trump's orbit have suggested that military spending cannot continue on its same upward trajectory. I think the Harris team has been a little bit less explicit on this point, and yet you can find others in the Trump orbit that believe that the military budget should go up considerably. So I think it's an open question about whether or not the Pentagon budget as a whole and nuclear spending in general will continue on its same path.
I think if you're looking for an area of true bipartisanship in Washington, you don't have to look any further than wasteful and ineffective defense policies. It's just ubiquitous across both political parties. I have to try to counsel people over the years, about this. Like Chris said, the current program started under Obama and has been carried through now across the administrations. And it doesn't really matter who's in the White House, which party, who it is, because the national security establishment endures, and like all the practices of the Pentagon and the defense industry will carry on, no matter who wins the election. So I don't anticipate any dramatic changes.
With that said, assuming the modernization continues as it is, we're talking about $1.7 trillion on the U.S.
With a T.
modernization.
Trillion
with a
with a T.
Yes.
With a T, yeah, trillion. How likely is it that this program this massive overhaul of the weapons arsenal, how likely is it even successful? Is it a slam dunk that this huge amount of money will actually succeed in doing what it's meant to do?
I highly doubt it, and I encourage everyone to be very skeptical about that, because the same national security establishment that is currently trying to modernize the entire nuclear triad is the exact same system that has produced failure after failure over the last 25 years. I can give you countless examples. The Littoral Combat Ship, the Army's Future Combat System. We spent anywhere between $8 and $31 billion on that program, depending on which source you cite. And it produced nothing more than a bunch of fancy PowerPoint slides. Not a single usable vehicle came out of that program. Same thing with the F-35 program and the Marine Corps' Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle. All of those systems have been failures over the last 25 years, and there's been no fundamental reimagining of the way the United States designs and builds weapons. As a result of that, so that exact same system is trying to now build the B-21 program, and trying to build the Columbia-class submarine program and the Sentinel program. And we're already seeing a lot of the same kind of problems. The Sentinel program has completely busted through its budget, had an 81% cost increase over its proposed budget when it was begun, and they now have to go back to the drawing board and try to reconstitute it in some way. Now, if passed as prologue, and I think it is, the F-35 program went through similar growing pains. Originally, that program was supposed to cost somewhere in the vicinity of about $200 billion to design and build the fleet. And when they went back and they re-baselined it after it busted through that budget, we got a program that cost twice as much And nearly 23 years later, it still is not an effective program. So I'm highly skeptical that any one of these three programs are going to end up delivering anywhere close to the promised capabilities at the cost that were originally projected.
What would need to happen for them to succeed?
We'd have to go back to the drawing board, honestly, and because we'd have to really get down at the design level and simplify the design. The Sentinel program is a really good example of that. We have existing missile silos out in the upper Midwest, but yet the Air Force came up with the idea of designing a completely new missile that does not fit in the silos. So we're not only designing the missile, we have to rebuild all the missile silos that go along with it. And that's actually where most of the cost came from. It's the same. It's the same kind of pathologies exist in the B-21 program and in the Columbia-class program, where we're going back and we're starting off with a clean sheet design, and the designers try to pack in every single conceivable gadget into these designs, which is ultimately the source of a lot of the delays and the extra cost growth that goes along with it. And because those pathologies existed from the very beginning of these programs, I think it's, again, highly doubtful that they're going to be successful. And I don't see any evidence of anybody wanting to go back and reimagine the way that the United States designs and builds weapons.
Chris, the U.S. is obviously not the only weapons state throwing money at nuclear modernization right now. Of the official weapons states, I think all of them have very aggressive plans to modernize and or expand their arsenals.
Yes.
And probably that's the case for the other four non-official weapons states.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to say what Israel's doing, but probably doing something.
Yeah.
How inevitable is it that, is there any potential that globally the course might shift, or are we on course for just a major new arms race, basically?
Well, I do think that among the major nuclear weapon states, the United States, Russia, and China, we are in the middle of an arms race, and the same sort of arms race dynamics we saw in the late 1950s and early 1960s between the United States and the Soviet Union is at play today, now with three major nuclear weapon states. Of course, the Chinese arsenal is much smaller than the U.S. and Russian arsenals, but it's growing. So we are in the middle of a race where some of the justification for expanding the arsenal is in response to the threat posed to that arsenal by rivals. So that's classic arms race behavior. On proliferation, which is sort of embedded in the question, are we likely to see more nuclear weapon states? I'm a little ambivalent about that. If you had told someone 40 years ago that we would only have 9 nuclear weapon states at this stage, they would be surprised to learn that, because of course this is not new technology anymore. And yet many states have chosen not to go down that route. And I think there is some people believe that we are on the cusp of a major new horizontal proliferation, where you have more new nuclear weapon states. I think that's still an open question. And I think that certain measures that can be taken, and it's been talked about in this conference in terms of limiting and controlling and tracking the spread of nuclear material, is going to, would raise the costs for any country wanting to go down that road. And so that's something we should pay attention to.
Do you agree, Dan? Are we on the cusp or not of horizontal proliferation?
I think I agree with Chris. I don't think there's a great deal of danger that we're going to see this massive expansion of the number of nuclear states. Because I think for many of them there's just no reason to, and I don't think that the cost would outweigh any potential benefits that they might derive from it.
Yeah. Another considerable area of just energy in the nuclear weapons space is this push for, or the discussion over, tactical low-yield nuclear weapons. And that is from Russia mulling their actual usage in Ukraine to this push in Washington for sea-launched cruise missile nuclear armed with a W-76-2 warhead. How much would such tactical weapons, or how much would or do such tactical weapons shift the deterrence calculus?
I think tactical nuclear weapons are one of the most dangerous ideas imaginable. there's a reason why only 2 nuclear weapons have ever been used in an actual war, and let's all pray to God that that's exactly how history remains. Because deterrence, the idea of mutually assured destruction and deterrence, it's as the author Annie Jacobson said in her book Nuclear War Scenario, deterrence is a psychological effect. There's a taboo right now about using nuclear weapons, in the real world. But once that taboo is broken, we can never get that back. Yeah. And absolutely anything is possible. So the idea of creating a policy or building weapons that could potentially lower that threshold is incredibly dangerous. I hope that everybody that's involved in these kind of decisions has goes in with the assumption that if one nuke goes off, they all go off. And so I would caution everybody to abandon this idea of tactical nuclear weapons, because even that's just kind of theoretical. A nuke's a nuke, and that's exactly how we should think about them.
Yeah, it was no lesser peacenik dove than Ronald Reagan, who said that a nuclear war can never be won and must therefore never be fought, right? And that was the right sentiment when he said that. It is still the right sentiment today. The notion that these weapons, these lower yield weapons, not low yield, lower yield, right? This is the other fiction that people throw around. But these low yield weapons will make them more usable and therefore more usable, right? That should, I think, terrify everyone. I agree completely with Dan. I also think, just from a deterrence perspective, you ask the question, what things that have happened over the last few years would not have happened were there slickum ends in the arsenal 2 or 5 years ago? And I think it requires a certain sort of fantastic imagination to think that if only we had these in our back pocket, Vladimir Putin wouldn't have taken a bite out of Ukraine or another bite out of Ukraine. And yet that, at the end of the day, is embedded in this notion that we need usable nuclear weapons in order to deter the kinds of things that we have not been able to deter over the last decade.
You guys have lots of warnings about sort of current. To what extent are you screaming into the void, or do you think people in Washington are hearing what you're saying?
Well, at the end of the day, I still believe that money matters, and you can only spend every dollar can only be spent one time, even if you believe in the multiplier. It's not that big. So there is a competition for resources within the military enterprise for these different systems, and then there is a competition between the military and everything else that this society wants and needs. And so pitting those desired things against other desired things, I think at the end of the day, the other things that people want that don't go boom will win out. And again, not to diminish the fact that there is a very determined and interested group of folks who benefit from the things that go boom. They are vastly outnumbered by the people that benefit from things that don't go boom.
Yeah, as I further analyze defense spending and the current plans and their future implications, it becomes increasingly clear that we cannot afford to do everything that people have planned now. There's a growing bow wave of future defense spending that is brewing right now because the national security establishment has started not just the nuclear modernization program, but we're continuing to buy F-35s, and we're buying Constellation-class frigates and 4-class aircraft carriers. Like, all of these different things are still in the works that are still in development. Well, you fast forward now 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and as those programs mature through the development process and they go into production and then into operations, and operations is where a lot of these costs really start to hit home, these things just become increasingly less affordable. We're talking about $1 trillion defense budgets today, But if these current plans go forward, in the next 20 years, we'll be talking about $2-3 trillion a year defense budgets.
Annual, $2 to $3
Annual,
trillion
yes.
a year.
Every
Annual,
year.
with a T. I mean, I think it's those kinds of numbers. We've become inured to billion B, right? Even though even that is sort of hard to actually get your head around when you spend a little bit of time. And there are just so many other things that we want. And look, the more honest folks in this debate will say, it's true, we need to raise taxes and cut spending on things like Social Security and Medicare in order to fund a $2 to $3 trillion military. And I would put to anyone, I'll make a wager, how many people in Congress right now would agree to state that publicly in their closing campaign? Count on both hands and fingers left over, okay? I promise you. No one is making that case. The only people who are making that case are those who don't actually have to run for office.
And on that note, I think we're out of time, but thank you guys so much. And please join me in thanking us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for coming out, talking and enjoying a day about disruption, I hope. But also to Phil for putting him in the hot seat as editor and particularly also on weapons, an area you don't generally talk to. To Ambassador Jenkins, Brian Finley, Kirk, thank you for being here from the industry perspective. And thank you to all of you and to our online audience. Stay tuned for more of these to come.